Now we're going to move into a ritual of conclusion, to coin a phrase. And I want to begin that ritual of conclusion by thanking the stalwarts who've stayed with us the whole time. I recognize your faces, so I know who you are. And among those stalwarts are the students in the urban design program here at UBC. And this event was largely for and with them as part of what we hope will be a way to launch them into a career which will have meaning and purpose and will be good for the world. And I think Matt's comments and the comments of others here have illuminated just how difficult that question of doing good can actually be. It's very hard to figure out how to do good. So we're only going to take a couple minutes for this, but we have a couple of the keynoters remaining here, and I'm going to surprise them with requesting something that they don't know is going to be requested of them. So I'm going to put Albert Pope on the spot and ask you if, after reflecting on this for all of today, what you would sum up as a message to our urban design students, in short, about how they could do good after reflecting on all this. I have a microphone here, and I think there's another one coming.
Like a nightmare, someone pointing to you in your dream. You talk now. But I've been impressed by the things I've heard today, and raises questions. There's a lot of local information here, and there's also a lot of politics. The problem of social injustice dominated, I would say, the day, which is interesting, and why that becomes the focus of a symposium that's related to design, I think is a super interesting question. Just not to drag it out or make another lecture, there's this adage, which is oftentimes attributed to Albert Einstein, which is the following: problems are never solved at the level at which they're manifest. If I could repeat that, problems are never solved at the level at which they're manifest. In other words, let's say that my hand is tingling, and what am I going to do about it? Well, I'll put lotion on it, and maybe I'll put a glove on, and I'll maybe exercise it or something, focusing on the problem with my hand. But we all know, because we know medical science, that that's a nerve problem, and it's back in the central nervous system. In other words, the problem of the hand is not going to help to put cream on the hand. You have to understand the level. You have to understand the level at which the problem originates. So I think in some ways what we can do as urbanists is stand back and say, maybe there's another level at which this problem originates. And in the case of gentrification, which is obviously horrendous here, and it's horrendous around the world, actually, has a lot to do, for those of you who are here this morning for my presentation. In around 1950, we switched the mode of urbanization. We no longer build blocks and streets. We build discontinuous cul-de-sac, subdivisions and housing estates. So all of the displacement that's been talked about, the question is, where are these people have been displaced to? Right? And we oftentimes describe that as a black hole. Oh, they're out there. They're gone. They're no longer on the city grid. And it has to do with the fact that gentrification has gotten so intense is because we're not making more of the substance that we refer to as urbanism, which is continuous blocks and streets. We haven't built blocks and streets in an anthropomorphic scale in the last 50 years. Maybe there are a few places where that's happened, but we switched our mode of urbanization into a very different kind of discontinuous spine-based urbanism. And that is the out there. And I think what in the question of design, design is not just for what is on this grid, what remains in the grid, right? Design can't just be about making the baubles that decorate the old urban block and street urban pattern. Design has to follow out to the types and address the types of urbanization that we've been building for the last 50 years. So I think the sort of tracing back the problem of gentrification has to do with the fact that what we call urban is very limited. It's limited to a form of block and street urbanism that we haven't reproduced in 50 years. And designers love the city. We love the scale of the city. Every project in my school, the architecture school I teach in, is on a grid. But as I told you this morning, the grid is only 25% of the built environment of the world the urban world we live in today, and that proportion is shrinking. We've built that much since 1950, and we haven't built it out of blocks and streets. So I think the question that you were asking about, and several of you asked about, what is the role of design, has to do with broadening the idea of what urban is. That it's not about the wonderful new urbanist idol of blocks and streets, which is now a limited commodity. We don't build any more of it, right? But it has to be expanded to include design is desperately needed out there to wherever people are going to be displaced to, because our cities are going to grow. So I think in some ways what urbanism can do is actually trace back that problem to its source. And while the local condition is important and we can focus on it, the only way you're going to solve it is to step back and see the forest for the trees and understand the larger context in which these problems occur.
Perfect. Yeah, that was exactly what I was hoping for. And Anastasia, now that you've been forewarned.
Because I think that people are maybe tired. What I would say, and maybe following up, is that I think it was pretty obvious from some very rich discussions and conversations today and yesterday is that design is not acontextual. It is contextual, it is political, it does not work in a vacuum, and quite often designers may be extremely good in dealing with the physical and the topography, the aesthetics, and not very keen into dealing with the social and the political. And yet this is very much needed. We really need to know where we do harm or not, and we need to know for who we're really designing and who we're leaving out of the equation and why. And I think as educators, that's the onus is upon us to really teach these types of issues as well. And also the other thing, when I mentioned that design is not operating in a vacuum, it has to be dealt, I think this was my last question, along with policy. We cannot simply designing nice structures and not thinking about the policy question. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And you came back at just the right moment. We've been asking the keynote speakers if they have a message to leave to the students in a minute or two, in recognition that this is all about them. So Christina, if you have one message that this has put in your mind, reflecting on what you've seen and what you think, and the thoughts you've developed over your career, what would it be?
I would have one thing I'd like to share that I think is true or useful, and then a question that I would have to leave to the students for them to figure out. The thing I think it might be useful is realizing that the environment is an active agent in a way that's unprecedented now. And that's going to change the way we do urban design. We used to think of urban design as something about the structures and the social environment and the economics. We now have to add, I don't want to call it a hostile environment, but a rapidly changing environment that's going to challenge the functionality of these systems that we've built. sewage systems, electrical systems, we're really going to see failure of the systems that were built in the 19th century and the 20th century. So I think that's something urban design has to re-embrace to understand infrastructure in a new way. And I mean that in terms of landscape armatures, beaches and wetlands, as well as electrical systems and gas lines. So I hope that all of you will take that to heart and maybe consider learning more about infrastructure and landscape systems. The other thing is really a question, and I face it myself every day with moral ambiguity that Patrick called me out on, which is true. You have to figure out in this changing environment and in the economic booms and busts that we live in, how do you tell the truth without depressing people? And how do you tell a hopeful story without being a Pollyanna, without glossing over how really bad things could get? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's something we have to navigate on a daily basis. But I almost wish we would develop a kind of code of ethics to be able to make sure we're not selling a used car to people that's not going to work. We're telling the truth, but at the same time we're recognizing the need for a positive, motivating story. So that's a real challenge. That's a big challenge. The more you know about what the future may contain in terms of climate change, the harder it is to tell a positive story.
Thanks. So that gives me the chance to conclude this wrapping up for just a couple of minutes. And I think the code of ethics idea is a good one, and I think it's something for us to reflect on as professionals in a profession that doesn't really have a profession yet, certainly not in North America. So that's exciting, but frustrating at the same time. And your point about how do you be optimistic? How can you be hopeful? Because urban design, if it's anything, has to be a giving profession. Otherwise, why the hell do it? You would become a political activist instead if you get to that level of hopelessness about the actual possibility for doing the good, for doing good. And I think Matt's discussion and the discussion of many of the others have made it crystal clear how hard that is to be sure that you're doing good. For my career and his career and the careers of those of us with gray hair in the room, we thought we were doing good by creating Car-Free Street Day or planting trees on sidewalks or reviving what were only very recently declining urban inner city neighborhoods, only to end up, haha, the joke's on you, the ruling class, you've always been doing their service. So thank you very much and beat it. I've often thought about in Vancouver, the best thing we could actually do right now is send all of you in this room up to Capilano Reservoir with brown dye and pour it into the reservoir so the water would turn brown and fake a few tests that show lead in the water so that you could see the kind of property value declines in this city that they've seen in Flint, Michigan. And I'm quite serious about that. I like your idea of making land a common commodity. And by the way, to the students in the room, that's a very well pedigreed idea in North America, and it's been tried and supported by a lot of people confronting the same question of how do you actually obviate the excesses of the market when it comes to actual community development. So my last thought on this is actually very hopeful. Because we actually live in the best of times. And just giving you a North American perspective on it, I'm kind of sitting there reflecting on this while you're talking about, yeah, this is really terrible. But it's not as terrible as, from an American perspective, as the Civil War, when 1 out of every 3 young men were killed and brutally slaughtered to support an economic system that was really quite repulsive. It's not anywhere near as bad as the moments after that when Jim Crow laws came along and black people were hung for behaving in what was considered marginally socially unacceptable ways. In the Canadian circumstance, it's not as bad as when we were having the villages of First Nations people broken up and their children sent to residential schools. It's probably not as bad as that. It's not as bad as World War I, where the clashes of what were colonial empires at the time were playing out across across the world, and it's not as bad as the Depression when we had our first really serious collapse, which, as others have mentioned, capitalism, Christina mentioned, have happened before and will probably happen again. It's not as bad as the 60s when segregation in the United States was rampant, and the laws, you've said, which were promulgated across the whole continent, were just taken for granted, even in my own youth. It's not as bad as the Vietnam War era was during my youth. So, it's gradually, even though we live in this incredible world of globalization, it has gotten better. But still, I feel after all that, even more than ever, myself personally, very class-focused. I'm focused on the fact that as urban designers, my feeling has come to be that as urban designers, our first obligation is to, if we can do anything good, if we want to do something good, it's likely to be places that are not elevated, but they're rather the humble places. And I think that's really problematic because in my own experience, when you try to do that, you're likely to fail at that because in some ways, fail in quotes, fail in the eyes of society because that work isn't seen as heroic. You very rarely get your picture in the paper for doing that kind of work. You're not associated with the kind of the production of iconic elements in the landscape about which we've heard quite a bit and which are promoted by the larger global media, even our local media. They capture the attention of the people who give money to art museums and all that kind of stuff. So you're not going to be among the revered, you're not going to be among the famous, and you're very seldom going to be invited to the inaugurations of city mayors and things like that. So it's actually a very difficult thing to recommend, and I'm worried about recommending that because it's really quite a hard slog. But I think if at the end of your life you want to say, did I do the good? And avoid the conundrum that Matt has found himself in at this stage of the game, and me too, feeling like 20 or 30 years later you feel like I thought I was opposing the man, but the man actually I was doing his bidding at the end of the day. What I think is really hopeful, though, is the next 40 years, which is your professional careers, are going to see all of these conflicts and cataclysms come to a head. And I think there's going to be a lot of disruptions for you all in that context. The largest one that's pushing those disruptions is the climate change one, which is going to probably dovetail with the fragility of the economic system. And so ecological collapse will probably align, ecological fails, if you will, if not collapse, will align with economic fails. And if you look back on things like the 30s, actually that was a time of great advance for people who wanted to do the good. In the United States during the WPA era, most of the people doing interesting projects were often urban designers, and they got the support and fortification of the state in those days because the existing power structure of capitalism had collapsed temporarily. So it was a good time, really, for many, and a lot of advances were made. So you might find that your career has those occasions that in the midst of severe strains on the economic system and the ecological systems, your work will be quite valued. And then finally, it's very clear that during the next 40 years, those are the decades of incredible urbanization that we've seen, rapid urbanization around the world, not just in North America. In fact, not primarily in North America, primarily in the places that a lot of you come from. We'll see that rapid urbanization, and the urbanization will be the places of the humble. So I think that's going to be, obviously, a place that there should be great demand for people like yourselves to think about. And also, at the end of your working careers, it's likely that you will have survived and contributed to the creation of an urban world which will be finished. because it's likely that at the end of that 40 years, the population of the world, if we survive that long, will have stabilized. The demographics on that are very clear. The birth rates are going down around the world. So if that continues apace, even without any other interruptions, even without disruptions, there's probably going to be stabilization of the population of the planet around 9 billion, and then it will stay the same or perhaps even decline. So the cities that we're building now are the cities that are perhaps going to last for many millennia. And once that imprint is laid, as we see in ancient Rome, that imprint really doesn't go away ever. So I think you have this great opportunity, more so than the older people in the room, to participate in that. So that's all I'll say, and I'll end it by saying thank you very much to the students who've come to our part of the world to study with us. We're honored by your presence. Thank you to the rest of the people who've come very far, in some cases, to contribute to this conversation in their presence. And thank you, of course, to the organizers, the folks up in Justin and his technical team, and the people who've provided this brilliant space for us to inhabit for the last couple of days. Thank you to the committee. Thank you especially to Case and to Penny, who've chaired the committee. And thank you, of course, for our sponsors, which are a peripheral community, which isn't a place where the people being displaced from Vancouver are often ended up, as Matt has passionately told us, the city of Surrey, which is the place that is very interested in this, and is so interested they've given us a lot of support, so we appreciate that. So here's a hand to all of you and to all of us for this effort. Thank you.